In this video, we're going to talk about bias in survey questions. A survey, of course, is when you ask every single member of a sample set, so like your entire school, for instance, a set of questions. The problem is the questions that you ask them, specifically the way you ask them in the wording, could affect how they answer. So what you're trying to do is not introduce bias into the equation. Bias is when you make the decision go one way or the other, even if it's unintentional. It's kind of like you're pushing the agenda whether you mean to or not. The first thing that you don't want to do is combine two or more issues. So, for instance, if I was doing a little informal survey, or I was doing a formal survey, and I said, should school days be shorter and start earlier? Well, in some ways, I could get some support for this, because a lot of people want school days to be shorter. Students, mostly, and teachers, people who actually have to do it, wanted the days to be shorter. But the start earlier part doesn't really sell. Where I go to school, or where I work right now, school starts at 7:30 in the morning. So let's just say, for instance, I saw this question, and I wasn't really sure what it meant. All of a sudden, that kind of ambiguity makes the bias start to be eke into the equation, let's just say. Maybe that means that school days will start at 6:30 in the morning and they'll be 15 minutes shorter. So instead of getting out at 2:30 like the school does now, it gets out at 1:15 because we go an hour earlier, which would normally, the normal length of the school day would make us leave at 1:30, but we get out at 1:15. So 15 minutes less of school, and I only have to get here an hour earlier. That would be perfect for somebody who really likes afternoon, but not anybody else. So once I entered two components into the equation, it added bias to it, so it's not a good survey question. From there, we may deal with using double negatives. Do you not disagree? That kind of thing. Anytime you use double negatives, you're starting to add sort of murkiness into the question process, and people may choose the wrong thing and something that they don't mean. Overlapping answer choices. Overlapping answer choices are much like combining two or more issues in your question. If you give them choices and all of a sudden two things are involved in your answer, and it's sort of like, well, I'm answering this but not this, and that whole thing, that's when the overlapping answer choices become a problem. You want to keep answer choices as separate as you possibly can. I mean, they can have certain components that are the same, but you don't want to have them seem like, well, like the earlier start time question before. I didn't want one of the choices to be like start earlier and be 15 minutes shorter, and then you have start earlier and be shorter. It's sort of confusing about what does that mean. They're almost the same thing. So you want to make sure that they're as separate as possible. Using loaded words is a big deal. It's really how a lot of people who do surveys gain the information that they want to get even before they start. Things like, for instance, in the abortion debate, if you use pro-choice or you use pro-life, those are both positive words depending on what side of the argument that you're on. If you use the word poison as opposed to pesticide, that should be a problem. Anytime you start using adjectives, generally it becomes a problem. If you call a book, would you rather watch an exciting movie or read a boring book? Once you add those loaded words into the equation, you're pushing the mindset already. So you don't want to do that. And then asking a leading question. You don't want to ask questions where you say sort of like, don't you agree with this? Or wouldn't you say that this is true? Or blah, blah, blah. Once you start already assuming that they agree with you, then the questions become, kind of a big problem. The thing you don't want to do is have don't you agree that teachers are underpaid, or don't you agree that teachers get paid too much, whatever it happens to be. Once you start pushing that agenda into the equation, it becomes a problem. So, long story short, in your question, you should only focus on one thing at a time. Your answer should be very specifically answering one thing at a time. You don't want to use double negatives. And you never use loaded words, so don't use anything that sort of show a bias in the question. Don't presuppose things, and which would be the last one. Sorry. Ask leading questions. You don't want to ask questions that already sort of assume they agree with whatever you're saying, and then they have to disagree, because it sort of changes the mode. They're not giving a choice anymore. They're doing a yes-no based on your assumption that they believe something to be true. So that's it. In order to avoid bias in survey questions, avoid those 5 things, and then you should be making a reasonable survey question.